Tell us a bit about Kirk the Kid. We've shared some, but I gather you come from a prominent family of CEOs. A long
we
line.
do. We were CEOs because we were Christmas and Easter only. That's when we went to church. That's how we were from a family of CEOs. But I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My mom and dad were blue collar. Some Detroiters out there?
Ho-ho.
All right, there we go. Dearborn. Where were you? Oh, Grosse Pointe. That's the rich end of town, by the way. Yeah, just kidding. But grew up, my folks were both blue-collar assembly workers at Ford Motor Company. They had 3 of us by the time they were 21. So I have a 23-year-old who I don't think could raise a cat, let alone 3 children by 21. And so my dad would say that we ran out of money before we ran out of month. And in fact, we spent about a year of my young life on welfare, which is a really humbling experience, to see the bottom of the barrel of life. In fact, I remember one day my grandfather bringing over food. He was director at Ford Motor Company, and I remember him bringing food over on a Sunday, and my brother and sister and I were laying on the floor, and he walked in the door. He couldn't see us, but we could see him. He had this look of shock because there was not a stitch of furniture in our house. We had a TV on milk crates. And he was shocked we had fallen so far so fast. And I remember that look on his face, and it affected me as a kid because someone you care about and love looked almost disgusted by where you were in life. So we moved around a lot. We were military without the military. I went to 10 schools between kindergarten and high school. And so we were bouncing around every year or so where the jobs were. My dad would always say we have to outrun the layoffs. So I saw kind of an interesting perspective on life. So not necessarily from a true CEO family, but a different kind of CEO family.
And with that very humble background, we all have our own story of what we've heard or not heard about faith. That's part of what GLF thinks about. Was your family, like I was struck by Jim, your comments that you had this grounding in the church through your family, and it could be the synagogue or whatever. Did you have that, or was that not part of your story?
No, it really wasn't. Faith was something incredibly personal. You didn't talk about it out loud. In fact, my dad, my voice is cracking.
You going into puberty here?
Yeah, I'm 13 again. But my dad used to say people who talked about God or Jesus out loud were Bible thumpers or Bible beaters. So he never talked about it out loud. We went to church, like I said, on the holidays or when there was a crisis, when the layoff was there, or when we ran out of money before we ran out of month. And that was our lives. My grandparents, my paternal and maternal grandparents, never talked about their faith. We never went to church with my grandparents growing up. So I didn't have the inculcation of faith in my life. I was academically a believer, but not practically and relationally a believer.
And yet your great-grandfather, if I remember correctly, had left quite an impression on you, and he was a bit of a character, right?
He was. My great-grandfather, I was privileged and blessed to have him until I was 18 years old. He was, and I say this very affectionately, an absolute hillbilly from the hills of North Carolina. No offense, he was. He grew up in the coal mines, lost his finger in a mining accident. I mean, he was an incredible guy, but a mean guy in his early. And I didn't know that great-grandfather, but he killed a man when he was a police officer in Detroit, when he moved up from the south into the north, and killed a man, fled back to North Carolina, never was charged with it. But he talked openly about it. He had a faith conversion later in life, and he's taught me lessons in life that I still think about today. Now, I was a little kid. I didn't know what he was talking about. Things like how you treat people who don't necessarily matter to where you're going is who you really are.
Hang on, how you treat people who don't really matter to you.
Meaning can help you get something.
Right.
So I was 10 years old. I didn't know what that meant. Later in life, I started my first job at P&G. I treated my assistant equal to my direct boss because I thought that's what my great-grandfather taught me. He taught us lessons like we went behind my brother and I broke something behind his shed one day and I'm covered with oil. And he said, "What did you do?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "Nothing. Are you sure nothing?" I'm like, "Absolutely nothing." And, of course, I have oil stains all over the front of my shirt. He said, what you do when no one is watching is what you really are, your character. Yeah. And he just walked away. And talk about, impressing an 8-year-old, 9-year-old. He said things like that all the time. And it was very grounded in a conversion of faith that he had later in life. The guy who didn't have a high school education, who told me to stay away from girls till I graduated from college, who got his associate...
that's still a good lesson after you're married, too. Just a little reminder,
I absolutely follow that one, or I'd be in big trouble. But he got his associate degree when he was 65 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, so he got his GED when he was in his 30s, and at 65 completed his associate's degree.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your family's struggling. You graduate, no money to go to college, aptitude, but no money. How'd you end up at the University of Cincinnati?
Yeah, so I took a couple years off. I was a manager in a Wendy's restaurant, and my folks didn't have money to send me to college. So I worked for about 18 months, and there were two universities in the proximity, Miami University and the University of Cincinnati, and I chose the right one of those two. No offense to any Miami grads in the crowd. But I remember, going, and my first 6 months there, I was in the business school, and Dean Zemansky's here, but I had a professor who noticed me. Her name was Ilsa Hawkins. I was walking out of class one day, and she said, "Hey, have you ever thought about going to law school?" And I had been working 60 hours a week and going to school full time. I said, "Actually, no, I'm actually thinking about going to night school. I can't really afford, both from a physical standpoint and a monetary standpoint, to continue doing this." She said, "Well, go talk to my friend who's the assistant dean of undergraduate students. His name's Clyde Parrish, and see what he can do for you." Because at the time, I had been in school a year. I had a 4.0. I was just physically exhausted. And so I went down to make an appointment. And of course, the first appointment he could see me is like 6 weeks. So I was, in my mind saying, I knew this would happen. As I'm starting to walk away, he overheard it, and he said, "Hey, do you have a minute? Because I have an opening." I said, "Sure." So I went down, 10 minutes, told him my story, where I'd come from, what I was doing, what my dreams and aspirations were. He came back 10 minutes later with a piece of paper that gave me a full ride scholarship. 10 minutes after I was there. So that university literally changed my life.
How about that? Now, let me say, he's too modest to say it, but you've been part of the Board of Governors and you've been a huge donor, philanthropist, so you've more than paid it back, but it's a beautiful symmetry there, isn't it? Just extraordinary.
Yeah. But he challenged me. He gave me that, but he said at the same time, when you leave here, I expect you to make this a better place than when you came. And so he challenged me. So not just take the money and coast through, but do this and make it a better place. I don't know if I did that, but I definitely tried. And I think, I could tell you 20 more stories when I was there of what I call them my angels, who really, over the course of my life, and I look at my life, it's like breadcrumbs from God, is what I call them. Because they're examples of people who stepped in. Like Jim, I have to tell you, I shouldn't even be up here tonight after listening to you, because the number of lives you've touched, you were like so many people in my life who were coaches and teachers who found a student who had potential and they didn't know it. And, you were a blessing to these kids here and to many others. So it's an honor to be here and see you tonight. Yeah. Thank
you. So let's fast forward. You become a young marketing guy at the ultimate brand company in the world, and you're shooting the lights out, progressing rapidly. Along the way, by the way, you meet a checkout cashier at Piggly Wiggly. Does anyone know Piggly Wiggly?
We dig the pig.
It's sort of a 7-Eleven kind of a place, if that helps you, or a Wawa. And darned if she isn't attractive, smart woman of faith, and she, for some reason, sees something you too, huh?
I know, shocking. Yeah, she did. Yeah, she did.
And you're now married, 26 years or so?
26 years.
4 children. So this meteoric career, a lot of good mentors and friends along the way, seeing something in them, encouraging them. Then you head off, you get tapped, and you always know you're running for the big brass or the big gold ring if you get the international assignment. So you go to, was it Korea first?
South Korea.
3 years, and then Japan. Life is good. Are you still a quote-unquote CEO at this point, or have you switched further into your faith at that point?
Yeah, so when we got married, my wife has even a more interesting upbringing than I did. Her father was killed when she was 3 years old by a drunk driver. Oh. And left behind her and her 9-month-old sister. Her mom married multiple times. She was abused. I mean, it was a tragic story, but her grandmother every weekend took her to church and helped show her, the light of God in the world. And so she was very faithful when we met, and I obligingly went to church because I really liked her.
That's a phrase I've never heard before. Obligingly went to church. I like that.
Because I really liked her, and I thought there must be something to this church thing. And so, we went and we started. We had our first 2 kids, daughters, who are now 23 and 20. And when the company came to ask me to go to Korea, it was one of those things. The kid from the Midwest who, when he graduated from college, had never been west of Chicago or east of New York. That was my world. Going to South Korea, like, are you kidding me? Or that, I could tell you many stories about our decision-making process, but we go. Were there for a couple years, the most growthful period in my life. It shocked every sense I had. It made me a better leader. It challenged me in ways I never would have gotten. I was there during the economic crisis in 1997 through 2000, the aging contagion, for those of you who are bankers in the crowd. And I saw a side of life I never would have seen. But in 1999, it was July of 1999, the expat wives would tend to go back in the summer because it was 95 degrees, 95% humidity, and it rained. So they'd go home, and I'd come back in the middle of summer. I happened to have a meeting in actually New York City the week of July 19th, and I remember those dates, and you'll hear why.
Something happened, didn't it?
Something did happen. I'm jumping, sorry.
No, go for it.
So we came, my 6-year-old, 3-year-old daughters were here with my wife in Cincinnati. My wife was going to come up here and meet me for the weekend, and on Monday night when I arrived, I called her. This is before the day when you actually had cell phones that worked across country, when there's SIM cards that allowed you to talk.
So for the Brunswick boys, something called a telephone on the wall.
You had to actually dial telephone. But Monday night, my wife said my oldest daughter, Carly, was not feeling well. She's sick to her stomach, and she'd been looking forward to this camp, and she missed it. So I said, is she okay? And she said, yeah, I think she has the flu. The doctor said come see her tomorrow night. So the next night I called, and she said, well, I had to go to the doctor tonight, and he felt something under her rib cage. He's not worried about it. He's going to do an ultrasound tomorrow, nothing to worry about. And so I said, should I come home? She said, no, I'll see you tomorrow. Don't worry about it. So that day, I went to I had a meeting at Time Warner in the city in the morning, and I forgot a folder in my hotel room. So I came back to the hotel. The light was blinking. My wife calling me and saying, call me at this number. No message, no nothing except that. So I called, no answer. I called my sister-in-law who watches kids, no answer, which was weird. Then I called my mother-in-law. When she heard my voice, she wept. And she put my father-in-law on the phone, and he said, I don't know how to tell you this. And my heart sank because I thought, I got a car accident, what happened? He said, Carly has cancer.
6-year-old.
What are you, like, in my world, you ever see those movies where you have the extreme close-ups where I felt like in Psycho when the whole world's moving, and that's what I felt like in that moment. It literally knocked the wind out of me. And here I am in New York City, living in Korea, my wife's in Cincinnati with a kid who they need to operate on immediately, or else something's going to happen, and I can finish off the story later.
Well, why don't we stay in that zone for a moment? So let's. What happens to dear Carly? What happens to you, and how did your faith change in all this?
She had kidney cancer. Her kidney, when they opened her up, she had a 1.25 pound Nerf football, essentially, picture that, consuming one of her kidneys. And we don't know how long she had it. She was way on the upper end of the range for this type of cancer that she had. So they took the kidney out, sewed her back up. She started her chemo, and all kinds of things occurred. She ended up having a surgical adhesion that blocked her colon. She had to go in and have a foot of her colon taken out. But that point is where my faith really dramatically changed, because I, at that point, to be honest with you, during this phase, hated God. Hated God. How can God let my daughter suffer? How can God, who loves us, supposedly, let a kid suffer? And so when we took her to the hospital to get her colon clipped out. It was a long story, but I'm going to condense it dramatically. The day they found out, we'd been in the hospital 6 days. She had a morphine drip every 10 minutes, click, 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 tube down her throat, couldn't even keep ice chips down. It was the worst thing as a parent I've ever been through. Saturday morning, I called the docs and I said, you get her taken care of, or I'm taking her to Cleveland Clinic, or I'm taking her to Mayo, I'm taking her someplace else. So they did an emergency MRI and found, I remember, I'll never forget, we had taken her back and we were running down the hall. And they come and open the curtain, can we see you in the hall? Which is never good. So we go out, and the doctor said, she has an adhesion. We think she has a perforated colon. We're going to have to open her up. We're going to have to let her air out for 2 weeks. We're going to clip it out. We're going to air her out. She's going to have to have a colostomy bag for 6 months. Here's my 6-year-old taking chemo with a colostomy bag, open wound for 2 weeks. This is what the prognosis was in that hallway that day. I hated God. Run down the hall. We're waiting in the emergency room, or in the anesthesia area before she goes into emergency surgery. It's Saturday afternoon, beautiful fall day. I'll never forget it. And it's both 5-hour surgery. They give her a vial of morphine to knock her out. And I remember it was this weird thing. My wife and I are across from her. She's laying this way. The anesthesiologist is over her. He puts a vial of morphine in her, and she doesn't even feel it. Like, her eyes are starting to roll back, but she's crying. And she grabs the anesthesiologist and she pulls him to her face and says, please stop it. I can't take this anymore. Stop this pain. Stop it from doing this. And she looked at me immediately and said, Dad, only you have to stop this for me. And I'm standing there just weeping. And I'm not emotional, weeping because my 6-year-old daughter was begging me to stop her pain. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. So we went out and they rushed her back. And then an hour and a half into her 5-hour surgery, boom, the door kicks open, the doctor comes out, full garb, gloves, blood, mask. Imagine how you'd feel. Nobody else in the waiting room except us. So, of course, you take her breath. He's like, great news. We opened her up, no perforation. We clipped her, put it together, sewed her back up, no colostomy bag. And literally, my wife and I just, we, of course, thanked the doctor. But when he left, we dropped to the floor and wept. And I'll never forget, this is where my faith journey became much more dramatic. My wife, as we came up to our knees, she looked at me and she looked me right in the eye. She grabbed me by the cheeks and said, can you imagine how God must have felt when his son was hanging on the cross screaming out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He could have stopped it, but he didn't because he loved us that much. We would have given our lives to stop Carly's pain, but we couldn't. That's God's love for us. And that was where I, for the first time, understood that God was with me. And he doesn't make bad things happen, but in a fallen world, bad things do happen. But through all of those things, he teaches you how to endure things later in life, which is another story that I'll share at some point. Yeah. But, that's where our faith journey really began, which could have been a tragedy because as I was talking about today, we met so many families who never took their kids out of that hospital, but who had the most unbelievable faith that you can imagine, even though they lost their kids.
It's extraordinary how some prayers are answered the way we want, and we could find God there, and some aren't, and we could still find God. And obviously, in your case, you were happy with that answer.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, because that's intensely personal, intensely sad. And I'm sure many people in this room have had a moment with a loved one who in particular child, is very, very hard. So thank you for that. If it's at all possible to transition from that.
Yeah, how do you pivot? By the way, she's fine today. She's fine. I always forget to clear
that. She's That changed you as a leader. You told me when we were chatting that up until then, all of the success which you had enjoyed, if you frankly, more or less how you put it, was because of your hard work. Pulled yourself up by the bootstraps, worked your butt off, worked harder, smarter, faster, longer than everyone else, and it was kind of you. It was the me show. Yet this began, you say, to change your heart a little bit. And how did it impact your leadership style, even your own perception of your own quote-unquote success?
Yeah. Honestly, I hate to say this publicly, and I don't think I've said it in quite this way or in this forum before, but I was not a good husband or father at that point in my life.
That's kind of putting it out there, yeah.
I rationalized what I did, and when I say what I did, by the way I worked. Maybe like some of you, I sacrificed my family early in my career. I worked hard. In Korea, I would say I woke up in the morning before my kids woke up to go to work, and I'd come home after they went to bed. I was an absentee dad. I was an absentee husband, at best, on the weekends. I traveled a lot, and I always said the reason I'm doing it is because I want to give my family a better life than the one that I had. And, that was just me talking to myself, though. And I was always self-congratulatory about my success because, I did it, and I just worked hard, and that's just a function of the fact that I can outwork people. But, when I went through that, it flipped my life around because I started, I'd moved pretty quickly, but I moved even faster after that because I made choices in my life. Like, I had one calendar. I used to have two calendars. I'd have my work calendar and my family calendar. And it's amazing what I dropped off my family calendar to make my work calendar a priority. And I changed that. I said, no, nothing can ever supersede a family thing. That'll always be, when there's a tie, family always wins. I would, as a leader, I didn't have a lot of empathy for people that had problems because I was like, hey, pull yourself up, bucko. You'll be okay. Just work through it. It's fine. Pick yourself up, rub some grass on it, rub some dirt on it. It'll go away. You're all right. That sounds awful, but that's the way I thought. And for the first time in my life, God put me on my knees, made me dependent on somebody other than myself, which was him. And it really transformed me as a leader because I started listening more. I started really listening, not just hearing, but listening to people and knowing what they were going through and trying to empathize with them. And it caused me, and I spent more time at the beginning of meetings asking people how their weekends went. How many of you, when someone asks you how your weekend went, say, I had a really bad weekend. Like my wife left me. found out my husband was cheating on me, got fired, whatever. How many of us really do that? Like, I ask people, like, no, cut the crap. What happened to you this weekend? I can tell. Like, I really try to get that out of people because it taught me when I was in that experience that you never know. And I had people pushing me in the hospital when we were getting my daughter treated. They were like, quit saying you're fine. That's a bunch of crap. You're not fine. It's okay to be vulnerable. And I think the other thing I learned as a leader is what I'm doing right now, I would have never done ever. I can tell you that with 100% certainty had that not happened with my daughter. I would have never put myself out there and have been as real as I'm being right now.
So did that slow down your career because you're spending more time, you've changed your priorities? Did that put you on the slow track, or?
Actually, it made me insanely focused, and I actually think I did better. I mean, if I knew I was going to be out of there at a certain time, I didn't screw around. I didn't water cooler gossip. I didn't spend time in meetings that were absolutely useless. I would go through. How many of you have ever had an absolutely useless meeting? Nobody? Come on, nobody in there. So what I used to do, I got some things that I would do to clear up my calendar. Like on Monday morning, I would send out a note to anybody on my calendar for the week and say, is there a decision required? Is there help you need, or is there something you need to personally talk to me about?
Hang on. Is there a decision required? Is there help you need, or is there something personal you need to talk
to me about? And if the answer to these three things is no, send me an email. And you would be amazed how much time that freed up on my calendar to do actual work.
I think it's just been worth the price of admission with that little tip tonight.
But let me tell you, it didn't happen overnight. Like, people pushed back. They'd show up in my office with, like, hey, I just wanted to share this with you. I'm like, did you not get my email on Monday about, like, if you don't have it? Well, I wanted to take you through it. It's a little complex. I'm like, I can read. If I have questions, I'll let you know. But it takes some training to help people understand, like, you're trying to change. And so the problem for me was...
So you'd create time for the personal things, but not for the sort of the unnecessary business things. That's the distinction. Got it.
Yeah. And I think, what I would tell... People saw me, and it's interesting, they saw me Kirk pre and Kirk post. And I think they had a hard time believing Kirk post because they knew me pre, right? This isn't the same guy we knew. Look at this guy. I'm not sure he's real. And so they kind of waited it out to see if I had really changed.
One of the things that most people face is invariably in a senior position, you're going to have an underling, and they could be actually very senior, just as you're senior, could be a senior person who's reporting to you, where they do something, let's say they breach a code of conduct. Maybe they've, even with all the money they have, they cheat in their expense account or something like that. Now, you've encountered a few shared. On the one hand, the Christian faith and many other faiths talk about forgiveness. It's sort of central to Christianity: grace, mercy, forgiveness. Have to forgive someone 7 times 7 times 7. And yet the corporate world says, no, hey, one strike and you're out. I got the regulators breathing down my throat. What if the media finds out this is going on? Sorry, we have zero tolerance for cheating, or whatever the breach might be. How do you now, as a Christian and as a business leader, combining those, not two separate things, but how do you navigate this? Can you think of a story or two where you've had to deal with that?
Yeah. So, I can tell you that in a general, I can't single anybody out, but as a senior leader, a lot of times you see the muck in an organization.
The what? The muck?
Muck.
M-U-C-K.
M-U-C-K. Muck. M-U-C-K. In an organization that I just want to make sure I didn't stumble on that word. But you see kind of the underbelly. You see the bad things that happen, and there are some clear-cut things of sexual harassment and other things which you just absolutely have to cut the cord on that, because that's not accidental. That's very intentional and very hurtful to people. But there are other things which technically aren't gray, but where a contrite person can actually use the opportunity of grace, which is defined as an undeserved gift, to turn themselves around. I mean, I had a couple, what happened with my old employer is we had a team of internal security that were former FBI agents, and what would happen is when things happened on expense reports, you as the manager, them, and then the former FBI agent would be in the room. And there's like a whole table of paperwork, and it's like, what do you have to say about this? And interestingly, most people came out fighting, like, oh, you're accusing me of something very defensive, this is crap. And the sad thing is that over time, we found out they were lying. They came out fighting and they were lying. But then there was a group of people who look at it and go, I screwed up. I screwed up, I made a mistake. And so generally, the security folks would say, fire him. We go in there like, just get rid of him in the meeting. Like, don't even listen to him, but then move on.
They've admitted it, move on.
Move on. Like, you got to, because usually people that do this once will do it more than once. But I believe, that grace is I need grace every day. And it's always a judgment thing. Like, I am not as good of a judge as God is by a long shot. But on things like that, if I feel like someone is really apologetic and it was an honest mistake or it's something they just missed, or, if they were like, oh my gosh, I pay it back. I gave 3 or 4 people breaks that ended up being some of my best employees. That ended up like redeeming it and validating that faith that they deserve that gift of grace. And it's not common. I mean, I got counseled every single time, just get rid of them. But I ultimately had to make the call, and I was responsible. So if they came back and did it again, I was the one who ate it. But you know what? I just believed in my gut that was the right thing to do. And I think in my old Kirk would have just gotten rid of everybody. I wouldn't even had a meeting. No reason. Proof is there. We're done. But the new guy who understands the power of grace and understands the power of redemption, which is really the story of my life, redemption and grace. I think that's, for me, how I think about it.
It reminds me of a story of a friend of mine who's not given me permission to say his name, but I'll just briefly tell the story. He made a major mistake that cost the company. It wasn't so much of an ethical breach, but he just did a bad business call judgment, lost a ton of money for the firm. And he was going through the loss review on it, and his boss, as part of the review, took the full blame for it. Took the full blame, as opposed to saying, Charlie did it. Yeah, wow. And afterwards, Charlie says to his boss, like, what was that about? And he said, someone once took a bullet for me. I'm taking one for you. Pass it on.
Wow.
And he meant it also in a theological sense.
Wow.
So you've got the star in your forehead. Some organizations, IBM used to have it, this high potentialist. You're on the hypo list. You have the capacity someday to run the business. And even one of the former CEOs said to you, hey, not this round, but next round, you're a candidate to maybe be a CEO. You'll be in the running for that. And yet now I'm interviewing you. You're at Google. You're not at P&G, and you loved it. So there's obviously it wasn't a dissatisfaction issue. What's a truncated version of the story that led you from a place you loved and the world was your oyster to go into a very different operating environment, different industry sector, and so on? And how would you it's a long one, but how can you condense that?
Sure. That's a clear sign to make it very brief, and I will. You said it twice,
and
so
I got it. I got it. No,
I got it.
No, it's a great story.
So the simple version is, I was flying through P&G. I was one of the youngest presidents. I was the youngest president in the company, and I had an opportunity to, at some point, potentially take over. And I felt God. We were in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we loved Cincinnati. I always said we were planted, we were growing, and we were content. We had our families there, our friends are there, the university is there, all of the things that matter to us in life are there. And we just felt a pull from God. I didn't want to go out and pay 10x on my house. I really didn't. I didn't want to, but I tell my friends in Cincinnati, add a zero, that's what you have to pay out in California. I didn't want to change industries in my mid-40s and learn this crazy thing called tech when I was 23 years in CPG. I didn't want to go reboot on the faith front where in the Valley 4% of people attend a faith service on a weekend. I was like, are you kidding me, God? But there were, I'm at some point in my life going to write a book about the story of the journey to Google, and it was just God's thumbprint all over it. And it was an incredible act of obedience for me. I was not necessarily, I can tell you, it took me 4 months to be convinced to do this. I said no more than once to go out there because I just didn't feel, I didn't want to feel what God was telling me to do. I didn't want to feel it. Have you ever had those situations where you should be doing something and you're willfully trying not to do it? That's what I was doing because I just didn't want to hear God, yet God was screaming out to me. So we move out, and that's the condensed version. We move out.
That's very condensed.
And there's plenty of other stories. We move out.
Can I say one thing, by the way?
Yes.
So I was in Hong Kong yesterday, and I was there for about a week and came back yesterday. One of the things we were talking about with a group of business leaders was callings. What does it mean to be called? And we looked through all the sort of the old biblical narratives of the classics, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and even the New Testament disciples. And almost to a person, every one of them says, oh, no, God, you got the wrong guy. I don't want to do it. Moses says, I stutter. I'm not articulate. I'm an escaped felon on the run. I'm not going to, no way. And what's your name? And who are you? No one's going to believe me. And obstacle after, and I've come slowly to believe that the most genuine callings are when the person doesn't really want to do it. It's not, oh, please throw me in that there briar patch. They really don't want to do it. So it just rings to me very biblical, if that doesn't sound too weird to you. That's an extraordinary story.
So we move out. I commuted the first 8 months, which was the worst thing that I've ever done in my life. I left Monday morning, came home Friday night. In addition to all the travels I did, I didn't see the people in my life that gave me oxygen every day. It was a hard 8 months. We had a senior in high school, so I wasn't going to be worst dad of the century moving a senior in high school. So then my family moves out. The transition as a senior leader in a new industry is not bump-free. It was a challenging transition. Just because I had to learn a new culture, I had to learn a new company, I had to learn new peers, bosses, people, everything. I was building...
everything,
yeah,
right?
everything. Build a new organization within a really great organization that's growing 20% a year in a crazy big company as it is. And then last year, it was the weirdest thing because we were struggling with why has God brought us here? We're like, okay, we haven't planted. We don't have many great friends. The place we loved, you ripped us out of. What in the heck, we didn't say heck, is going on here? This is on video, so I've got to watch it. So last February, I had a lump in my throat for a year, and typical guy, right? And I was getting ready to leave P&G, didn't get it checked. It was a year later. I'm like, I probably should go get it checked. Got it checked, and it was okay, actually. It was just a swollen lymph node, but they found a lump on my thyroid. And I ended up having thyroid cancer. Stage 2 because of my age. I was over 45. They opened me up in early May. It had spread into my cavity, my thyroid cavity. I was stage 3. In July, when I went for my treatment, it had spread into my lymph nodes in my neck and in my neck area down here, stage 4. So it had progressed. It's a typically benign cancer that's generally really treatable. Mine, for some unbelievable reason, was a little more aggressive. I always like being first in things and best in things, so I got the most aggressive form of it. But I really it was so interesting to me because I wrestled with God mightily. I yelled at him, cursed him, just as Job and others have done in the history throughout the Bible. But what I learned was obedience, and I learned about faith, and I learned that he puts me in a place for a reason. And only in hindsight, generally, can I see the trajectory of why I was there. I mean, I happened to go to a thyroid surgeon who is the best thyroid surgeon, one of the best in the world, at UCSF. And the biggest risk with that surgery from a surgical standpoint is you nick vocal nerves. And I like to talk. So not being able to talk would have been a major problem and a challenge for me. But by the grace of God, I can talk. And by the grace of God, I have been clear now for 9 months post-treatment. And I don't know, did he put me there because I would add another chapter to this crazy story called my life? That when you look at me, I know when you look at me, here's this white middle-aged guy who's had all the success. You didn't see the poor kid in Detroit. You didn't see the kid that lived in a trailer park that got called trailer trash when he was 10 years old. You didn't see the kid who didn't have faith when he got married and went to church because his wife wanted him to. And you didn't see the guy who had cancer. I bet none of you thought that. Maybe you read about it or heard about it and Googled me. But you don't always, that amazing product called Google.
I've never heard a Googler use that. That's good. I like that. I like that.
But for me, it was just, sometimes you judge and you don't know, and I do. Like I would have the same judgment of me if I were up here and I didn't know me. But that's how God works. He uses people in ways you don't expect, and that's how the kingdom works. Not how the world works, but that's how the kingdom works.
Do you have a favorite, passage or narrative from the Bible that just kind of keeps you anchored when all the world is tugging at you and you just need to sort of center yourself a little bit to make sure you stay grounded as a leader?
So two verses. James 4:8 says, "Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you."
Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you.
In Hebrews 11:1, faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you cannot see. Those are my two. Those are the go-to scriptures for me. And again, in the story of my life, those are the things that I anchor upon, my faith and the fact that God will draw near to me if I only draw near to him.
Yeah. I want to go back to your move to Google. You clearly, the folks back at P&G must have been sad to lose you. How did you, and they kind of sent you, I know we truncated this story, but part of what took you to meet the Google people was you were sent out kind of you were being mentored, and they wanted you to meet some people in the high-tech industry to learn and grow as a future leader yourself. What happened with that, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah.
So you go back to Ohio and say, boss, Mr. Lafley, whomever it was, I think I'm going to move, or I'm going to move on. How did you play? That must have been difficult conversation.
Yeah. For those of you who work for companies for a long time, it's like you're part of the family, right? You're 23 years. I grew up. AG, who was the CEO at the time, was the one who brought me to Asia and took a chance on this young kid from the Midwest to live in South Korea. So I felt like I was telling...
Like disappointing dad almost.
Yeah,
right?
I felt like I was telling the mafia I was leaving. And, it doesn't always end well. And I remember I couldn't sleep for a week, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to share with somebody because there was no reason I left. And I remember it was an interesting meeting because AG was like, what job do you want? What are you looking for? I said, honestly, nothing. You couldn't offer me anything that would make me stay. No money, no title, no position, unless maybe you want to give me your job. No, I didn't say that. I was thinking it, but I didn't say it. But I said, no. Yeah, I said, really. I said, I know this sounds hokey, but I really am following God. And it was an interesting. It's like, how do you counteroffer God? What's the counteroffer to the God card? There is no counteroffer.
I'll meet you and raise you one.
Yeah, how do you trump that? But it was excruciating few days. I mean, but I knew it was right. Someone told me, it says this in the Bible: let your yes be yes and let your no be no. And when I told Google yes, and I'll finish the story. I told Google yes on Friday, October 25th. And the reason I know that is because I said yes, and I told the company on Monday because that's when our equity window opened. So I had to make sure that was open for 30 days so that I didn't leave everything behind. And I remember the night, so part of my story is I was challenging God because when I had just given a message at a church I went to in Cincinnati called Crossroads, and I was telling a story about my daughter's journey with cancer and how that affected my faith. And so I shared it with Google. I said, this is who I am. If this is too bold and too crazy, I'm not your guy. And I shared it with the chief HR leaders of the company. And I thought, they're going to run from me like a wildfire. They're going to want nothing to do with me. A couple days later, the woman who's big part of my narrative sent me a note and said, Google will love you. You will love Google. I hope we can make this work. I'm like, come on, are you kidding me? So the day I said yes, that night, I get an email. It was her, I can't believe this. It's so great. You're going to love this place. It's like a 5-month journey of me going there. So she says, the reason you haven't heard from me in a few weeks is my daughter, who's in college, we found out a couple weeks ago, has cancer. Funny how the kingdom works. She said, I don't know why I'm writing to you. I don't know you that well, but that video you sent me from this summer has had me thinking all month about maybe you're here to kind of help me through this. And I felt like God took this stamp and said, good servant with whom I am well pleased, great decision to follow me. I felt like literally, and I could give you 20 more of those, but that night I knew God blessed this and was happy that I did this. And frankly, over the course of the next year, her daughter went through this, and then I got sick right on the tail end of it, and she helped me. I mean, it's crazy how the currency of the kingdom actually works.
I want to, as we begin drawing to a close, I want to ask another question. I spend a lot of time doing some advisory work with large, prominent multinationals like yourself, talking about ethics and culture and how do you create. Let's say you've sort of you've fallen wide off the mark. You're trying to rebuild your ethical culture, or you're a strong company trying to sustain it. So I was researching Google, and of course, many of us will know when it was founded, the great phrase "do no evil" or "don't be evil." Sorry, "don't be evil" was its sort of unofficial motto, which kind of nets it out, don't be evil. Now, notably, that also reminds us that there is something called evil. There is badness out there in the world, however you think of it, theologically or just practically. But I went to see, so what are your core values and core principles? And I'm digging around, and if you can't find something in Google with the Google search engine, there's a problem. So I found that Google has something, 10 things we know to be true, and there's 10 statements. They're sort of business truisms, one of which is you can always make money without doing evil. The mission statement says to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. But I just could not find those 4 or 5 taglines that I'm going to find at any other established company. Any company that's been around forever will have their core 4 values. So is Google, do you not care about ethics? What's the deal?
So Google has flipped many things that I thought to be true about the business world on their head. And this is one of them. I grew up in an industry or in a business that was 175 years old. We wrote down everything, the purpose, the values, the principles, everything was there.
It's classic blue chip business practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go to Google, don't be evil. One of the first things I saw, the first week I was with the company, Eric Schmidt, who's our chairman, sends out his notes that he shares with the board of directors to every full-time Google employee.
Wait.
With this on the headline. Sorry.
These confidential board notes he
Yes.
sends out to everybody.
Says, we trust you. Do not forward outside the company or you will be fired. But the fact is, we share them with every single person who is employed by the company. How many of your companies do that?
Zero.
I've never worked for a company because we're like, oh, there's no way people can handle that information. I mean, they're only our employees, but we're going to keep them in the dark a little bit on this because can't trust, they're not senior enough. But Google empowers people. What I love is what I've learned, may or may not be true, N of one, but sometimes you fall into this false sense of security that when you write things down, you got everything covered. It's almost legalistic, right? And then people look for the seams, look for the loopholes. We're a loophole society, right? We look for how do we figure out how to get around that? What is the letter of the law and what is the spirit of the law? Like how many debates have we had in a business conference room about the spirit and the letter of the law? What I love about the Google culture is don't be evil is pretty broad. Pretty broad. And if you don't know the definition, you probably shouldn't work there because there's a level of subjectivity associated with don't be evil, which then makes what you do potentially not fit into, there's no loopholes, there's no seams. If you do something and someone says, that is evil, then you're not going to be employed there anymore. So what you have is almost this self-regulating culture where people aren't looking for loopholes or seams. They're looking for this truism of not being evil. And I got to tell you, I'm an old guy there, all right? So the average age of the company is 30 years old. I was the youngest guy on AG's senior leadership team. I'm one of the oldest at Google. It totally is a flip of mindset. But the other magical thing in my company that I came from, the first company, people were promoted from within there. They started their careers and finished their careers there. Everybody worked there for a lifetime. Google, we bring in people from all different kinds of companies. Think about that. All these different cultures coming in. There's no lifers. Google's been around 17 years. Here's an interesting fact. I started in December of 2013. I've been there longer than 47% of full-time employees. Imagine that, and that's not from attrition, by the way. We have incredibly low attrition. We just hire a lot of people. But imagine bringing all those people together in this patchwork quote culture, that you get them to not be evil. And you fire, I have had not a single firing of somebody for an evil offense at Google, and I've been there 2.5 years. And I run a pretty good-sized organization. So I think that the way we're doing it is potentially the way of the future for at least companies that are starting now that are going to be able to have more broad but trust-based cultures that allow people to really be who they are.
That's interesting, a trust-based culture. Yeah, Steve Reineman, who we've interviewed many years ago when he was the chairman and CEO of PepsiCo, came and spoke. And what he always talked about in his leadership training classes, and he'd be with some of the elite, sort of high-potential people, he'd always say, I don't care what it is, but you need to have a North Star.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, and I'm not trying to idolize Google, it has its flaws like any company, but it sounds like there's a guiding principle, a North Star, in kind of almost playful, hip language, don't be evil, but it really sparks a conversation,
yeah.
It sounds like. Question, is there any dark side, though, to that? Meaning, some people say the bright young folks you're hiring, it's a bit of an entitlement generation. They go there, they've got gyms and free food, and they can work when they want or don't work. Sometimes the world isn't that way. That's a pretty elite sphere of society. A lot of people have to play by a different set of rules. Any thoughts on that?
It is an incredible, if anybody seen the movie The Internship?
Right,
so that gives you a little, now I'd say not all of that's true. Really, don't want to burst your bubbles. Not all of that is true, but there is free food. There are nap pods. There are volleyball courts. There are gyms.
Any squash courts? Just checking.
We could build some for you, Jim. If you come out, Jim, we'll hire you to be the squash coach.
There you go. Right? There's a retirement gig.
Oh, all right. I'm going to accept there. But the interesting thing is, in any culture, you can have an entitlement culture. I don't care what perks you give. At the end of the day, Google is the most disciplined company I've worked for. I don't say that. It's unbelievably rigorous. We do performance evaluations every 6 months. We just cut it down from every quarter, where everyone was rated on a scale of precision that you wouldn't believe every single quarter, and very tied to your performance, very tied to your delivery of your results, very tied. I mean, it's incredibly, and you can't become a $70 billion company growing 20% a year if you don't have discipline and people working hard. Sure, there are people that don't cut it in that culture, but if you've ever interviewed or seen an interview with Google, we find the right people. And the interesting part of the culture is if you're not succeeding, we view it as our failure to help teach you and coach you, or not putting you in the right role. Because we have, I talked to 22 people, and it's a consensus. So the guy who wanted to hire me, our previous COO, he couldn't just say, I'm hiring Kirk. He had to have 22 people all head nodding and giving me good enough scores to get in. So I wouldn't be his guy. I would be a guy that 22 people said is googly. Define that. Googly. It can deliver the business, is going to build the organization. They had to all agree on that. So it's a pretty rigorous place. So yes, in any culture there's entitlement. But I think we do a pretty good balance between giving people a lot of things to make them feel valued and comfortable at work, with also demanding that they work really hard for that. So
terrific. So my last question, it's a question I ask my students. I build my ethics course around 5 Qs, 5 questions. And the fifth and final one, this is see if you pass. Now, are you ready?
Ooh, all right. High pressure.
Now, and there's no right answer, just what's personal for you. How do you stay ethically fresh? How do you stay ethically fresh? No one goes into work saying, I'm going to commit fraud today, I'm going to cheat today, I'm going to make an unethical decision. But through pressure, unintended consequences, goals and outcomes that are overvalued, maybe being jet lagged or having to drink too many, any number of reasons can cause a good person to do something stupid. How do you stay ethically fresh and on your game?
So one thing is, I always have somebody who I call my emperor has no clothes person to tell me when because I don't think it happens. It's a slow fade. I don't think it happens right away. I think there are things you slip into that are okay, and nobody's looking. You need somebody to say, hey, you're stepping awful close to that line, to kind of wake you up. And give somebody the freedom to be able to say that to you and be safe in doing it. And I always have somebody who I do at work. I empower them to be that to me, and I have somebody at Google who does that for me. The second thing is I always say I run with a pack. I have a group of guy friends and a men's small group. I still have guys in Cincinnati that I do weekly accountability calls with, and we just talk about real life problems and real things that I'm dealing with, and real life situations and struggles I have, and things I'm thinking about, and temptations, and they always bring me back to center, because they're my North Star. They help me see truth. Because it's easy, and you guys are all successful. I mean, people put you on a pedestal when you don't deserve to be on a pedestal. I mean, we were just talking back when you came up here. You didn't say one thing about yourself. You talked about everybody else. You put everybody else on a pedestal. You didn't say hardly one thing about yourself. That is a guy I want to run in a pack with. And I try to find people like Jim who, really help me understand what grounding is. And those are my friends that I count very dear, and some of them are here tonight. And the last thing is I stay grounded in the Bible. And I know that sounds cliche, but I find when I'm drifting from the Word, I'm drifting from who I should be. And it helps me kind of center myself and know that, there's things that I should be doing that are important that maybe I'm not doing, and so it helps bring me back. So that's what I do.
Wow. How about a big round of applause?
Thank you.
You could see by the rapt attention, other than the boys having to go back for bedtime, that
I saw them slip out in the back. Yeah.
They just your candor, your story, the mixture of personal, of work, of professional faith. I appreciate you putting it out there for us. I think in different ways, all of us can connect to that. I heard 2 themes in what you said, and you used the words once actually, but throughout it was just themes I heard of one of redemption and one of grace. That there's been times when your whole life has been redeemed. You could have been a statistic. You could have gone a whole different path, and you and your family have had an experience of being redeemed, and not because you earned it. Even though, as you said, the first half of your life was because of your hard work and bootstrapping. But no, you didn't really earn it. It was this unmerited grace and love that you received. So I thank you for sharing that. Well, thank you all again. But one last word after our applause again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now and then I'm inspired to do what I'm going to do. Usually I just say goodnight, we'll see you later. But if you don't mind, I'm going to close with just a blessing. And then you're welcome to stay and mingle with friends and so forth before you head out. So let's end our wonderful evening together as a blessing. May we go into our places of work tomorrow knowing we're redeemed. May we know we are still a work in process and far from perfect. May we find meaning and purpose in our work that sometimes is the work and sometimes the people with whom we work. Whatever we believe, wherever we are in our journey, may we be so humble and bold as to be the face of Christ at work. Go in peace and don't be evil. Thank you all.